Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual edition of We Robot 2020, the premier international conference on law and policy relating to robotics, hosted this year by the University of Ottawa Centre for Law, Technology and Society. Reinvented in the times of COVID-19, We Robot 2020 is presented with the generous support of Microsoft, CIFAR, X, and Intel, as well as the University of Ottawa, the University of Washington Technology Policy Lab, and Miami Law. For those who are not familiar with the WeRobot format, please note that the authors do not present their own work. Instead, session discussants read the author's paper in advance of the conference and present the author's work to the audience, while offering constructive thoughts for improvement and seeding the conversation that follows. Authors then have around 5 minutes to respond to discussants' feedback. Then the session opens to the floor. For the virtual edition, we invite audience to engage with the paper in the comment section below the video. For this session, we are delighted to welcome as a discussant Bryant Walker-Smith from the University of South Carolina to present People, Packets, and Fairness in the Age of Algorithmically Controlled Mobility Shaping, a paper by Jason Miller from the University of Ottawa and Elizabeth Gray, a lawyer from Ottawa. A link to the paper is available under the video. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Bryant, to start the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I'm really delighted to be presenting this paper, and I think it's only fair that everyone try to say this title at least once. So Jason and Elizabeth, I will credit you for your paper, People, Packets, and Fairness in the Age of Algorithmically Controlled Mobility Shaping. Again, that's by Jason Miller and Elizabeth Gray. I understand the link is below, and I will be talking briefly about the paper and then interchanging my own thoughts about it. So first, the paper focuses principally on navigation apps or routing providers, but it hints that there's something more. There's something more coming, that this becomes an issue really in combination with future technologies, or as these apps evolve even more and become even more intrinsic to our lives. And so I think one of the repeated implicit suggestions is, well, what if these are eventually linked with automated vehicles or other forms of transportation systems beyond just an app that tells you turn by turn how to get somewhere. And it points to a phenomenon that I've called geographic indifference, which is in the future, we're no longer going to say, well, I'm driving 10 miles to the northwest. We won't really care if we're going 10 miles to the northwest or 20 miles to the southeast. We may not even say anymore, I'm traveling 10 minutes. At some point, we may simply say, I'm getting food in 10 minutes, and we'll be largely indifferent to where that is or how that happens, just that it happens when we want it. And so the paper takes this idea of navigation apps becoming increasingly central and uses lessons from principally the internet. First, it sets up the history of these apps or their predecessors going really back 100 years, and just some fascinating anecdotes about a time before computers when we navigated by LP, more or less. Then introduces an equivalent history of what's broadly termed net neutrality. Then applies it to these services that Liz and Jason call mobility shaping, introduces some of the key ethics of this realm of mobility shaping, and starts thinking about ways that regulation could lead us to optimal outcomes. I want us to take just one step back and note the analogy that keeps arising, which is between the digital realm and the physical realm. And in this paper, Jason and Liz really try to bridge those two realms. And there are certainly very many similarities, right? So I could say, oh, come visit me at my URL or come visit me at my office. I'm not there, don't go there. Each of those has a standardized address that we've agreed in advance is the way to address it, to label it. Each of those exists on a very decentralized network, whether a network of computers or a network of roadways. And I might draw a distinction that I think could be explored more in the paper, which is the internet is actually much more decentralized in terms of its routing than the navigation apps that we use in the physical realm. I might use Waze or Google Maps or Yandex or Baidu to get all the way from my home here up to Gatineau. But if I want to send an email, it's actually going to take a route with far more of these individual providers. And this struck me because one of the things I had to smile at is when Jason and Liz refer to, quote, the more familiar context of net neutrality. I will admit, as a transportation engineer, I find the realm of transportation actually to be far more familiar. And it made me think of the category of retronyms, right, where we talk about snail mail, because when we say mail now, we think of email, acoustic guitar, because guitars can be electric, and perhaps physical mobility, because mobility now is so much connected to our digital realm that we have to emphasize that much in this paper and much in the world of physical transport, we are talking about the physical realm. And this actually brings me to a suggestion about perhaps framing for the paper, which is, as I understand the evolution of the analysis, Jason and Liz start with the well-entrenched notion of common carriers that we see in Canadian and US law and give a very nice history of this concept. Then they apply it, as many have, to internet service providers and say, well, internet service providers, at least in Canada and briefly controversially in the US, have been classed as common carriers, and then they apply that same concept to navigation services, to apps, and say, well, are there lessons, are there analogies, does it work? And then I think they hint, well, these navigation services are increasingly going to be mobility providers in their own right, and then they end up kind of back where they started, not expressly calling for the application of common carrier in a traditional sense, but suggesting strongly that these mobility providers have many of the characteristics of a common carrier. So I got a little dizzy and thought, well, is this paper taking maybe a long circuitous route where we could all just take, the short route and say, well, common carriers. What lessons can we apply from common carriers in the old, traditional, boring physical sense? And there, I think there's actually a lot of value that then this paper can bring into the content section, which we'll turn to. And so just a note of what I mean by this. The archetypal example, at least in the United States, is the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. I promised you we would be old school. And this act established very important principles that still resonate today. For example, it shall be unlawful for any common carrier to make or give any undue or unreasonable preference or advantage to any particular person, company, firm, corporation, or locality, or any particular description of traffic in any respect whatsoever, or to subject any of the same to undue or unreasonable prejudice or disadvantage in any respect whatsoever. So we have these two prongs: you can't favor, you can't disfavor. And it's not just your customers, it's nearly the world at large. This language, by the way, at least in the US, has been incredibly powerful. So if we think back to the civil rights movement, this was the language that allowed, or some people might say actually forced, the then very powerful Interstate Commerce Commission to declare that segregation on interstate buses subjects Black passengers to unjust discrimination and undue and unreasonable prejudice and disadvantage in violation of the Interstate Commerce Act, and is therefore unlawful. So even before we had many of the civil rights acts, this language from the 19th century was being used in service of civil rights. Now, what happened in the Interstate Commerce Act? deregulation, but many of its principles can still be found throughout U.S. law, in federal consumer protection law, in non-discrimination law, and in a variety of state laws. And I understand that Canada, in the similar process of bringing this over to telecommunications and then to the internet, has many of the same concepts. And I mention this because it seems like this set of laws actually gives a lot of the structure that Jason and Liz are pulling from the internet domain. And I'll give you three examples from the paper. So paper describes three key internet concepts: zero rating, throttling, and blocking, and very thoughtfully applies them to routing providers, to navigation apps. I'm not sure that, at least in this part of the paper, we necessarily need that middle step. So zero rating. Well, to evoke the language from 1887, I would say that would refer to any undue or unreasonable preference or advantage in any respect whatsoever. How about throttling? Well, any undue or unreasonable prejudice or disadvantage in any respect whatsoever. And blocking. Well, here we have another provision of that same act, which seems to apply, if not directly, then very similarly. Every common carrier shall afford all reasonable, proper, and equal facilities for the interchange of traffic between their respective lines and for the receiving, forwarding, and delivering of passengers and property to and from their several lines and those connection therewith. Here we're staying firmly in the physical domain and having a structure with decades and, in fact, over a century of precedent. Now, these structures, undue and unreasonable, leave a lot of content open, right? They're all to be decided, even if we have a lot of structure and maybe even substance to draw from. And this is where I think that a lot of the thought from the paper from the internet domain could fit very, very neatly into the next section, where Jason and Liz try to give substance to the ethical issues that are essentially embedded in undue and unreasonable. And I think there's a lot of potential here. So, one example that the paper mentions, and I'd like to expand a bit on, is net neutrality. In the internet domain, there is a strong, although by no means universal, sense that net neutrality in some defined form is really important. On our physical infrastructure, I would emphatically reject that and go a little bit further even than Jason and Liz and say all traffic is not created equal. We should start from the very, I think, sensible premise that the idea of putting a diesel spouting machine on the road for the sole purpose of distracting people stuck around it is not valuable, and is certainly not as valuable as an ambulance, as Jason and Liz mentioned, or a bus. And in fact, the reality is that today, unfortunately, all traffic truly is not created equal, and perhaps in ways that do not align with our societal objectives, where pedestrians are stuck winding in between cars, blocking the road. And so as we think about the content of these principles as applied to mobility providers or mobility shapers, I think we need to acknowledge that status quo is not perfect. Now, the paper does this. It mentions existing inequities. I would go even further. The status quo on our transportation facilities, around our transportation facilities, is unacceptable today. And so new technologies offer certainly challenges, but tremendous opportunity in comparison to that unacceptable status quo. To provide three examples from the US, very respected scholars call our system of transportation today transportation apartheid. That's a pretty serious indictment. We can go back to a pivotal book, The Power Broker, and see all the problems that have arisen because we do not sufficiently involve communities. Or we can go to more modern reports, for example, that about the metropolitan Atlanta's transportation system, and see the problems with deferring to powerful communities. And so the democracy at work in transportation policy, as described in the paper, is tremendously messy, and I don't think necessarily all that democratic in its implementation. So the paper identifies three core ethical issues. I describe them as equity, access, and authority, at least in shorthand. And this is a great way to start the conversation. I think a lot of the paper's value could be importing more content into these areas, whether it's lessons learned, as I would tend to say, from the physical realm, or if it's lessons learned from, I think Liz and Jason would say, from the digital realm. Three points for that. First, the paper gives a great example from Gatineau, Quebec, which is one of my favorite cities. And it reminds me of a similar example about how Google Maps has effectively renamed entire neighborhoods. It has slapped a label on an area that previously had another name or no name, and its power has led to the effective renaming or repronunciation of that entire neighborhood. The second is, as the paper notes, people are not locked into a navigation app the way that they might be to physical infrastructure. We know, for example, that many Uber or Lyft drivers already use multiple navigation apps. And technical structures like APIs in combination with legal structures like the GDPR from Europe could make this kind of real-time app competition even smoother for ordinary users. So I think this private-private interface, a world of platforms might deserve more treatment in the paper and more differentiation from some of the analogies that it refers to. The second is not the private-private realm, but actually the private-public realm. And I write a lot in these areas, particularly the privatization of the public sphere. And so the example that I've offered in some of my writing is the idea of a pedestrian who steps out in front of a vehicle. This could be a wonderful change of power dynamics. The vehicle, let's say it's a vehicle with advanced driving system or even an automated driving system, stops, but identifies the pedestrian through advanced facial mapping and links them back to an individual person. At this point, the company operating the navigation service, the automated driving service, the ride-sharing service might report them to the police, or the company might simply say, well, you know what? We are blocking you from our platforms. Not only can you not take a ride in our vehicle for the next month, but you know what? You don't get to use all of our other mini services as well. And I think that is another example of how the physical and digital realms perhaps do have a necessary interface that introduces the kind of novelty or import that the paper alludes. So I'm really looking forward to talking more about all of the ideas that Elizabeth and Jason present in their paper. That paper is, again, I think I can say it in one breath, People, Packets, and Fairness in the Age of Algorithmically Controlled Mobility Shaping. Jason, Elizabeth, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, Brian, thank you so much, first of all, just for the really thoughtful and thorough discussion on the paper. As is always the case when I'm listening in on these sessions or actively participating in one, I've got pages of notes already. So I think what I'll try to do is, I can't in 5 minutes address all of the points, but what I will do is give just a quick back up and maybe give a sense of why we approached the paper the way we did, because certainly you mentioned that this whole the focus on net neutrality maybe, or the focus on the digital first and then the physical second, or trying to get to the physical through the digital seemed problematic. Maybe I'll be able to offer a little bit of insight on why we chose that particular route through, again, all these no pun intended, but through the issues, right? And then we can get to maybe a more detailed discussion on the individual points if you want to, if we should raise them, or if you feel like raising them as we go through the discussion. So let me just start by saying that I think, and Liz, feel free to jump in whenever. This is, we'll just treat this in the spirit of a kind of casual conversation it's supposed to be. So I'll start by saying that part of the focus here, I think, on focusing on the navigation apps as an anchor to thinking about automated driving is that it, to me felt like an issue that, and as we say at the beginning of the paper, it's under, there's not enough focus in the public on this right now, right? So when we think about automated vehicles and in the conversations surrounding automated vehicles, it tends to focus on, the types of advances we're making in replacing a driver's ability, like the kind of abilities that a driver brings to the car that are still a challenge for driving, right? And we're talking about steering, we're talking about pushing the brake, pushing the gas pedal, identifying signs and stopping accordingly, the kind of safety issues that go along with the toughest technical issues that the engineers still need to deal with, and that are, that are years away from happening. So we tend to focus on those. So automated vehicles are things that can drive the car, right? Navigation falls into this funny funny category in driving. But when we step back and look at it, we try to emphasize first that navigation is a huge part of driving, always has been. We've developed these systems for doing navigation manually over the years, and at times we've tried to automate that, but we don't tend to focus on the way that automating that part of driving, first of all, counts as automated driving, right? We tend to focus on these other skills. And then from that, we wanted to look, and Liz and I wanted to look at that set of automation capabilities and really push back on this idea that it's trolley problems and steering and braking and safety issues that we need to focus on when we're talking about automated driving, and really alert people to some of the issues that we see arising from this layer of control that's kind of being placed over the mobility system right now, and draw out some of the issues. So why so that's where we start with this paper. And so why do we focus on net neutrality? Well, it's funny that you say I love to hear this, like, it's fun, why did you start with net neutrality? It's not the most obvious thing. And we're all familiar with the kind of the physical aspects of driving, the physicality of a neighborhood and of streets and of the system of getting around that we've established. I don't know. You raise an interesting point there. I don't know why the net neutrality argument comes up as the anchor. I would suspect that maybe my intuitions, and I don't know, Liz, maybe I'll ask for your thoughts on this afterwards, is just that there's something that happens when I'm not going to phrase this properly, but there's a sense in which things that are too familiar fade into the background, and they can even fail to be, they can fail to present themselves as objects of critical reflection when they're just kind of happening in the background to such an extent. Driving seems to be one of those things. Navigation seems to be one of those things. Somehow the net neutrality debate and reframing a mobility network in terms of algorithms, of control, of a shift from whatever kind of control we have now to clearly corporate control, where we don't have any, we really don't currently have any means for interacting with those who are controlling that system. Seems like you've got enough of a jump, like a kind of conceptual leap from what's too familiar to think critically about to something that reframes that familiar thing in a way that we can start thinking critically about it, and then maybe move back to the physical. I think that's kind of the route that we took in the paper, right? I don't know if that rings true to you, Liz, or not. I don't know if that explains it well, but
I think that covers it well. I think. So the net neutrality context has been very in the news. It's lots of people have opinions about it. And you mentioned that, the internet is more decentralized in terms of routing than physical road networks are. There are only so many ways you can cross a continent, for example. But the level of control that an ISP can impose, particularly in underserved areas where there is one ISP, is pretty similar to some of the things we might be seeing with a few very powerful companies that seem to be controlling to a great extent a lot of the navigation decisions that we're making on a daily basis, even though the physical roads are already more centralized than the ISP's wire networks are. So yeah, I think we approached it in that way to show the parallels, but also just so we weren't just talking about physical concepts that feel very familiar and don't feel tangible, or not to say relevant, but don't have the same awareness right now as some of these more complicated, more current and more technically digital issues that we're looking at in the net neutrality context.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of utility in the jump to the digital, and certainly, I mean, let's be clear. I think the reason that we were focusing on net neutrality has a lot to do with this kind of, you know, our immersion in more of a tech law world where these debates are kind of, they've been around, you know, for at least, well, I don't know how long it's been now, 10, 15 years almost. Yeah. And it's like for us, I guess, just coming from a different background, being socialized a little bit differently academically, yeah, those feel like old, familiar concepts now. Debates that, granted, you know, most people still don't really know that much about. And yes, certainly people have a sense of how the physical world works in terms of driving and transportation. But yeah, I don't know, that kind of, you know, to kind of like thrust people into this world where suddenly you're talking about, you're kind of pointing out the control that already exists. And I want to emphasize also that we don't see this as as something that's problematic in the future. We tried in the paper really to emphasize that this is problematic today. We're seeing this already. Like, this control is already making itself evident in the types of controversies that are being raised, albeit, you know, one-offs here and there. People are, you know, cities and towns are kind of recognizing these issues that are starting to emerge, which I think for us makes it, you know, and you know, makes it clear that this is the time to really start tackling these issues. I do want to point out one other thing before I kind of wrap up my initial statements, which is just that I think your suggestion that well, your focus on the physical first, and the various things that you've very helpfully pointed us to, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 in the U.S. I mean, we were looking for one. You know, not being a lawyer myself, but, you know, I'm a kind of philosopher engineer. But I work clearly with lawyers quite often in kind of thinking through these issues. This is very helpful. This is why I was looking forward to this, you know, this feedback, and this is, I think, what WeRobot's just so perfect for, is getting this insight. So I think I was certainly struggling to find examples from, you know, the current thinking about transportation and mobility that would help us really clearly frame some of these ethical, policy, human, and in this case, like human rights issues, that would really drive the point home. Like, if we're layering this, if companies like Google or Apple or TomTom or whoever it is, through creating these kind of layers of architecture on top of the mobility system, if they're doing this, why is it that we should care about this? And are there examples where it's just become very clear that certain aspects of discrimination within the mobility system are problematic, and that we've acted on them? So I love these examples. I mean, I will absolutely be digging into these to try to get some to try to get some details, and certainly to flesh out those last sections, the sections that you've labeled. I think I have a note here somewhere: equity, access, and power, I think are the words that you use, and those align, yeah, I mean, directly with I think what we describe in those sections. So thank you for that. I mean, that's just fantastic. I'll have to think more, and you know, Liz and I think we'll have to discuss to what extent we feel like we could just jump straight into the analogy with the physical, or issues with the physical, and kind of circumvent the. I think I get the sense you're asking, or you're suggesting, that we circumvent the net neutrality a little bit, or de-emphasize it, or do something with the net neutrality argument that it is that you found distracting. I think, if I'm reading you right, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. We'll have to have more conversations about it. I think without these examples that you've pointed us to, that we'll certainly have to look into, it would be difficult to jump into those issues. Like, hey, we've got all these problems with access and power and control, and then, but it felt like the net neutrality was almost like the easy, low-hanging fruit to help frame this whole conversation. But it sounds like you're asking for us to do some, you know, to flip it on its head a little bit. So we'll have to think about that. But
and
yeah,
I
think that's it for now. Like, I'd love to just get into the conversational piece.
So I think this is just a fascinating perspective that the three of us are outing. In effect, I feel like it's almost as if someone said, oh gosh, I wish I understood what a pipeline was. I know that they are tubes, but what's a tube? And the answer was, oh, well, it's like the internet. And it's completely flipping on its head, you know, that old story. And maybe that is the pivotal moment that we're at, where, as you said, Liz, somehow the digital is now more tangible than the physical. It will explode my head, but maybe that's our new reality. I'm someone who tends to think that all law is railroads. Like, that's just the story of law. It is railroads. And any law you want to point to, I will point you to the railroads. And I think that perhaps your inclination is all law, or perhaps all ethics, or all is the internet. And that perspective may I think well carry the day in the future. But for a precedential system of law, I think so much of law is still in those structures of the physical realm that still apply to the physical realm. I agree with you that the kinds of issues that you raise need to be addressed now. So often people talk about philosophical or ethical challenges needing to be solved before we can have what we want, right? Like, law or ethics is keeping us from all the fun. And I tend to reject that. And I was glad to see that you did too. First, by dissing the trolley problem. Thank you. That needs to be properly shoved in a closet somewhere. But second, by recognizing that these are issues we need to deal with now before we lose the chance to deal with them, before the kind of power dynamics that you allude to overwhelm the political systems and make the decisions by default. And so actually, in that spirit, since you are on cam and I can make you commit and then you won't be able to get out, one of the courses I teach is a problem-solving initiative of interdisciplinary graduate students at Michigan Law. And this semester, we are focusing on algorithmic discrimination in driving. And two of the groups are tackling algorithmic discrimination with respect to access and algorithmic discrimination with respect to routing. So I think that the interdisciplinary perspectives that you are bringing would be so immensely valuable to that. May I get you to commit now in front of a live audience to helping my students out?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I'd love to participate in that. Of course.
That would be wonderful.
That's an easy ask.
So, I think we were talking about these structures. Do you start with the physical or the digital structure first? And my sense is that physical structure might be more useful, but then when you get to the part of the paper with the ethical content, that there where we should be pulling lessons from everywhere. And I think there might be some valuable lessons for what, undue or unreasonable discrimination actually means. And I'd be interested in maybe more ways that you can think that you could bring in lessons from the internet to the questions of even today, decisions made by navigation apps.
Yeah, sorry. Are you asking?
Sure,
asking
if you're up for it, yeah.
Or examples from the I mean, so I would have to think about that. Look, one of the challenges I felt we had was collecting it. Well, aside like the net, I feel like the net neutrality issues present. Because there was, well, in Canada anyway, there was a public response to the net neutrality issues. Maybe in the US, like the public response is kind of like dissipated or it was never felt the same way or something like that. Maybe people just didn't latch on to this issue. But there was certainly a public conversation around, I feel like, around net neutrality in Canada. People were aware and concerned about the issues of ISPs controlling access and shifting power and doing all these things, partly because Canadians love to complain about their ISPs, about their expensive phone plans and all these things. People are like, we're tuned into to the issues. Liz, you're nodding your head because this is like, maybe it's a Canadianism. I don't know.
And I mean, you're saying was, but it's also, I mean, it's still going on. There are still proposals coming. There was one, I think, 2 years ago, a very large consortium of ISPs proposed a, I forget what they call it, but it was essentially a blocking proposal. It was very, very overarching content blocking of anyone who was suspected to infringe copyright, basically. And because we have a pretty solid set of net neutrality regulations here now that are just the way the law works, it wasn't successful. But it's not that this isn't a dead issue in Canada, even though it's something that we've come to some decisions on.
And I completely understand that in the context of the internet. And I think what would be helpful is, can you make that equally concrete in the realm of navigation apps?
Right. Yeah. So I think that, beyond the examples that we've given, again, I feel like they're few and far between right now, right? We're at the early stages. We're starting to see these signals that these are issues that will blow up. I mean, but when we wrote the paper it was about a year, well, a little over a year ago now. I mean, this
year and a half, I'd say, honestly.
Yeah, it's been a while. Certainly, it's possible that it needs like significant. Well, I don't know if it needs significant updating. I haven't heard any concrete examples from navigation apps that are beyond the types that we're signaling that would kind of anchor the whole conversation and provide that common understanding that everybody has. I think this is the challenge. I think most people. So part of our goal in the paper certainly was to take apps that most people think of as serving in a singular purpose, which is to help them get from A to B in less time than it would otherwise take, or, and probably in circumstances, though less so, as we point out in the paper, in circumstances where they don't actually know how to get from A to B. So it's some combination. People look at these apps as some combination of getting there and getting there faster, or in the shortest amount of time, right? And so this really, I mean, the discussion that the kind of proto discussion that led to this paper was, why is getting there faster the only thing that these apps are designed to help us do? Why aren't these apps designed with all sorts of other values embedded into them, like helping us avoid the neighborhoods where there are a lot of kids while we're driving through a place that we don't really know that well? Like, why isn't there an option to keep me on the roads that are serviced by other mass transportation, like public transportation, like buses and things like that, because those roads are designed to be a little bit safer. They tend to have, sidewalks set back a little further. it started with this kind of focus on wanting to problematize apps that people take for granted as serving a singular, beneficent purpose in their lives, and that's it. Like Google is,
Waze will say it will get you faster and it will save you the speeding ticket.
That's right. Yeah, which most people would think of problematically as like it's like avoiding a toll route at that point, right?
Yeah. I like your reference to mass transit, because what you're talking about really is the issue of mass in a couple of ways. First, in transportation planning theory, there actually is something of a tragedy of the commons, and also something of a problem with informational ubiquity, that can actually lead to transportation inefficiencies if time or capacity is your denominator. The other sense of mass is what these systems have done is actually highlighted the existing failures in the system that were previously been exploited by just a few, and by making them exploitable by all, have actually forced conversations about these issues and allowed communities to more categorically shape their transportation systems. It's like saying, oh, there's a little bit of water that comes in through my roof. I'm gonna just go and dump a bucket of water and see where I get a flood. And right now we're getting the flood, and I think that might actually be ultimately useful. It's part of that search for what are now or soon to be the real concrete problems of this kind of informational ubiquity and default routing.
Yeah, I mean, and so in describing stress testing for the floods, it brings to mind the other purpose, I think, well, certainly that is embedded in this paper somewhere, which is to point out that this ability to control things in a way that we never used to have, it could be used for good, right? Like it could be used to improve safety, improve mobility, improve traffic flow, improve mass transit, improve rescue response, or the EMT services. It could be used for all of these things, but that's just not the trajectory that we're on right now, right? Because in many cases, those improvements require the kinds of trade-offs with incentives that are just that would run counter to the incentives that corporations like Google and Apple and others have in setting these things up. It's more complicated to interface with local governments to try to preserve whatever problematic, as you point out, democratic decision making is going on with respect to transit right now. But at the same time, and I don't want to slip into this kind of this kind of mode where we're thinking of these systems as potential utopias, because certainly they don't. We know now that that's not the trajectory that we are likely on right now. If we look at the way that the internet emerged and all the talk of utopia in early days, and how information wants to be free, and it's like anyone can do anything. And then you have people stepping in and pointing out that what we've created is a system of perfect control. We're trying to point out the system of perfect control. This is another reason why I think the internet is a good way to get us there, because the narrative that existed 20 years ago with the internet has clearly failed. It was clearly the wrong narrative that we were using to describe the potential that the internet had, if left to its own devices, right? And of course, its own devices is the people who are creating the tech, creating the algorithms, creating the platforms, and their incentives just aren't aligned to take into account public goods and freedoms and things like that. We know that now. It's very clear that that's so I feel like what we wanted to do though was remind people that in critically examining a technology, that despite that we may be on a trajectory, there are alternatives, right? It's not all bad. It's not that we need to get rid of these apps. As you point out, there are huge benefits that we could likely realize at the at the neighborhood level, if we're able to set up some sort of regulatory framework that allows for a more balanced control of whatever system is becoming rapidly the norm.
I think you're pointing really to the need to empower local communities so that they can be equal partners with companies, that they're not competing against each other, and that they can come to the table and say, well, these are our needs and these are our levers, and companies can say, well, here's how we can meet those. That's process-wise, I think, an essential point that we can derive perhaps from the internet or perhaps from the longer history of physical common carriers.
Right.
I'm curious to see. So recently in Toronto, we had the Sidewalk Labs project just come to an end. I mean, it's done now, right? So Sidewalk has walked away from that.
The end of the sidewalk, yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. As I was rereading this paper in preparation for today, it occurred to me that just that could use I suppose it could use an update, depending on how much we want to keep recycling through this paper and not just kind of You
did call it controversial, so you covered your bases.
So so I guess maybe it's premature to jump into that in the paper, but certainly it caused me to reflect on the questions surrounding that Sidewalk's departure. What was it exactly that led to that? Was it just there are the rumors that I've heard, and this is not substantiated anyhow, is just that the business model just stopped working all of a sudden. They weren't because they weren't given enough land or whatever it is that potentially it just didn't look like as much of a payoff at the end of the day. So I mean, somewhere in the analysis there, or I think that analysis should add something to this question of how well, it certainly is cause for caution when we start talking about a two-way conversation between these companies and municipalities. Look, Sidewalk is gone, but Google Maps is still there, right? So it's like the conversation has ended, but the layers of control are still embedded, right? In a certain sense, there just aren't these new layers that they were promising with all these other digital infrastructures. But certainly, a part of the research, and this is kind of future and ongoing research, is thinking carefully about how how can we build those conversations into these platforms, right? Because it's certainly not going to be it's going to be a dead end if what we propose is that the division of Google working on maps set up offices in every municipality and start having conversations at town halls about whether we should have a one-way street there that's digitally imposed rather than physically imposed through signage. I mean, so there needs to be some solution to that two-way conversation that has efficiencies built into it. But
you're saying, how do you align the physical and the digital? And that's something that companies like Google actually spend a lot of time working on. In effect, does putting up a sign that says "Do not enter between the hours of 5 and 7 p.m." Get reflected in a map, and then change behavior? I think it's a really interesting question, and where the discrepancies are between our physical understanding of the world and our digital understanding of the world, or our physical set of rules and our digital set of rules or behaviors.
And who gets to shape those rules? And is it a municipality implements rules that they make Google Maps or whichever navigation app follow, or does Google Maps or Waze say, actually, we've collected all this data and it looks like you have a massive transit bottleneck here, so you should put in place new regulations to open up some other streets? Will it be an interplay, or will it be the nav apps basically in charge? Is that where will the data go, and will it be going to the city? Will it be accessible to people? There's actually a case right now. It started in March, I think, but it's Uber for its bike sharing program and scooter sharing program in LA. The LA Department of Transportation has requested all the data so that they can plan mobility, basically, and Uber has refused to provide it and is actually suing the Department of Transportation on the grounds that it would infringe their passengers and users' privacy, which is interesting when you think about who you'd want to have that data, because someone will have it. Will it be Uber or the LA DOT? So
yeah, that's been really interesting. It illustrates how adversarial privacy is, and I think that that's really is, as I think you're bringing us to a conclusion, one of the interesting parts of your paper, the extent to which these future relationships are adversarial, are coercive, are essentially a new era of trusts, and what the proper relationship is among all of the public and private actors in here. And I really appreciated that your paper started to raise those issues and offered some very useful analogies for addressing them.
Thanks. I'm going to make one last point. I see Florian ready to jump in, but I do want to make one last point that I think is operating in the background of this discussion that we've just had nearer to the end about power and control. As it stands, we have no access to any of these algorithms. We do not understand. The public is not given any information about how these algorithms operate. To think of the algorithms just as things that get you from A to B in the least amount of time, I would be surprised if that was the only consideration being put into these algorithms. I suspect, though, of course, without transparency, we can't really, or without greater transparency, we can't know, that some of these other types of decisions are being built into these apps. The only way that we have of figuring it out is by kind of reverse engineering through experience and anecdote. Which is really ineffective and inefficient, especially when you're talking about these serious issues like access, power, and control, and equity. So
there are two ways to get to. There are two ways to get from San Francisco to Silicon Valley. When we see 99% of people being routed on the freeway, on the interstate, and all of the tech execs being routed on 101, then I will have my doubts. Until then, I'm interested in the incentives that might make that happen. But I will be watching, Jason.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, sadly, we have to stop that conversation here. Usually, this is the moment where people will just run to the mics to ask their question, and I feel like I might have been the first one on the mic to discuss net neutrality in Canada, because I've been commenting a lot about this, and also I love that conversation kind of opposing the digital and the physical, and in a book to be published in next month with Elizabeth Dubois, we argue that everything now is digital, just because one way or the other we're controlled by algorithm. Even when you just refuse to be connected, you're going to be controlled by algorithms. So I love that conversation. So thank you so much, Jason and Liz, for that amazing paper, and Brian for your thoughtful comments. And so I will invite everybody who has been watching the video to continue the conversation and give their thoughts, their comments, and their reflection in the comment section below. Again, thank you everybody for your participation, and have a good remaining of the day.
Thanks, Florian.
Everyone.
Thanks, everybody.